Kierkegaard, is faith irrational? About 500 miles east and a little north of England, where this talk is being given, lies the country of Denmark. You, like me, may not know Denmark for anything in particular, except perhaps Danish pastries, the fact that it is one of the countries that England is shortly about to be divorced from at the time this talk is being given on the eve of Brexit, and maybe Lego. But in the world of philosophy and theology, this country has produced one of recent history's most profound thinkers. Søren Kierkegaard, or Søren Kierkegaard if you're being pretentious and want to try to say his name the Danish way. His name means stern churchyard or graveyard, by the way, which will tell you quite a lot about him already. Why should you care about Kierkegaard? Well, in my estimation, and that of many others, he had some of the most insightful, influential, and interesting things to say about religious faith, the doctrines of Christianity, and the human condition itself. I will focus on his ideas about faith for this talk. He has also something of a reputation as the grumpy bastard of philosophy, having written voluminously about such cheerful matters as anxiety, depression, unrequited love, and death, which means in my experience that he often appeals to teenagers, to whom this talk was originally given. Indeed, as a brief aside, this is why he initially appealed to me. When I was 12, as a rosy-cheeked young public schoolboy, I once asked my grandfather, a nuclear physicist turned itinerant speaker on science and Christianity, who the best writers I should read to feed my budding interest in theology were. He gave me 3 names: Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Søren Kierkegaard. Now, those are quite difficult for a 12-year-old to access, but sometime later in my teens, I eventually got around to checking these writers out. Karl Barth's books I must not have been able to get hold of, probably because they are very expensive, since I didn't read any of him until I got to university. Bonhoeffer I found, put on my personal statement that I had read him, and then frantically read before my university interviews just in time to avoid that being a lie. I enjoyed Bonhoeffer well enough. But Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard! Imagine my surprise and curiosity when I finally picked up a copy of Kierkegaard's first important book, Either Or, at a time when I had by now read a lot of dense prosaic Bonhoeffer under my own steam, and various dry analytic texts for the AQA Philosophy A-level, and read, on the first page, after a bizarre, confusing, and quite frankly ridiculous introduction, "What is a poet? An unhappy person who conceals profound anguish in his heart, but whose lips are so formed that as sighs and cries pass over them, they sound like beautiful music." What? Excuse me? This was meant to be philosophy? This was meant to be theology? If it was, here was a philosopher-theologian I could get on board with. Here was a writer who understood depression, who understood despair, who understood the miserable git I had become in the intervening 5 or so years that had passed since my grandfather had first recommended him to me. I was a pretty morose teenager, in case you hadn't worked it out. I was instantly hooked on Kierkegaard. But enough about me for now. This talk is not primarily about me, though I will return to a little bit more of my own story at the end. Back to Kierkegaard. Let me give you a brief biographical sketch of him instead, before we look at one of his most influential and interesting ideas. The factual events of Kierkegaard's life are in some ways quite unremarkable, but in other ways utterly fascinating. Kierkegaard was born in 1813 in the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen. His mother died when he was 21, and it is also worth knowing that his father, Michael, an extremely wealthy self-made businessman, was plagued his whole life by an enormous sense of guilt, because in his youth as a dirt-poor farmer, prior to making his fortune, he had once loudly and angrily cursed God while standing on top of a hill. This was the reason, Michael probably believed, that death stalked the Kierkegaard family. For example, by the time young Søren was in his early 30s, he had lost not only his mother, but 5 out of 6 siblings, leaving him with only his depressive father and one older brother, Peter. You might begin to see where all the writing about death and despair came from. In school, Kierkegaard did reasonably well, and then he went to university at Copenhagen to study theology. At university, however, having his father's money to spend, Kierkegaard dossed around and lived a frivolous lifestyle. He called this his rebellious phase, but we don't really know what he got up to, and it might not have been that rebellious really by our standards, but who knows. And he managed to put off taking his final exams for 10 years, a whole decade, Just imagine the student debt you'd accumulate if you did that in the UK. Finally, though, Kierkegaard seems to have grown up and he sat his final exams in 1840, before almost immediately enrolling for the higher magister degree, his time's equivalent of our doctoral degree. He also witnesses to coming to take his inherited Christian faith more seriously at this time. Now comes the most important event of his life, though. While writing his magister dissertation, Kierkegaard met, fell in love with, and became engaged to a beautiful young woman, a family friend by the name of Regina Olsen. Here she is. Here's Regina Olsen. Quite beautiful, you might agree. Or maybe that's just me. Maybe I've just spent too much time in Kierkegaard's head. Kierkegaard's plan at this time seems to have been to finish his postgraduate degree, marry Regina, and become the equivalent of a parish priest. However, right at the point of finishing his degree, after a very romantic early 19th century courtship, full of poetized love letters and chaperoned carriage rides, all of a sudden, without any apparent prior warning, Kierkegaard broke off his engagement to Regina, jilting her, and left to go to Berlin. Why did he do this? Well, nobody really knows. The historical sources do not give us a straightforward answer, probably because Kierkegaard edited his own diaries from the time and crossed through large portions of them so that they became illegible. He even tore pages out of them. Speculation as to Kierkegaard's reason or reasons for the breaking of his engagement to Regina often link it to what he mysteriously referred to as his thorn in the flesh, borrowing a phrase from St. Paul. And this speculation has variously attempted to identify his thorn in the flesh as being everything from, including but not limited to, a hidden physical deformity, a chronic problem with depression, suspected impotence, fear that he was cursed to die young, maybe inherited from his father, epilepsy, an addiction to masturbation, or just the simple conviction that being a good husband would not be compatible with what he did soon go on to become. An absurdly prolific, semi-reclusive, somewhat self-obsessed, philosophical and theological writer. For that is what Kierkegaard became. For the next 12 years, after he successfully defended his magister dissertation, broke his engagement to Regina, and returned to Copenhagen, Kierkegaard wrote, and self-published, mind you, there are some quite good self-published books out there, book after book of literary philosophy, theology, and sermonic discourses, producing an astoundingly large and influential corpus of material in a relatively short amount of time, which may well not have been possible had he been a responsible married man. And this is just some of it on the slide. It goes off the end. There are many more books that followed, either or, The Edifying Discourses, Fear and Trembling and Repetition. The list goes on and on. And over the course of these 12 years, Kierkegaard's self-understanding and approach to his writing changed, which is what I spent time examining in my doctoral thesis, culminating in his parading the streets of Copenhagen, distributing a self-published series of pamphlets called The Moment, or The Instant, in which he informed his fellow Christian citizens that they were not in fact Christians at all, but that the Danish state church, the Church of Denmark, like the UK's Church of England, had completely departed from authentic New Testament Christianity, which in its genuine form was marked by such things as suffering, self-sacrifice, and a wholehearted, life-transforming commitment to Christ, not just by being a Sunday social club where you tick the census box saying you are a Christian just because you've been born in a certain place and time, but it has no existential relevance to you. And any Kierkegaard scholars who might be listening to this, I suppose, would want me to just correct the slight mythicization I just made a few sentences ago. These weren't distributed by him on the street, I should just clarify. These pamphlets, they had a circulation. They were published and read by the people of Copenhagen. But anyway, it was in these streets of Copenhagen that Kierkegaard one day collapsed, probably from tuberculosis, before dying in hospital a few weeks later at the age of 42. Why have I shared this brief story of Kierkegaard's life with you? Well, I don't know, you're the one watching it on YouTube right now. Why have you clicked on it? Why are you listening to it? I've shared it simply because I enjoy telling it and because I find it interesting. And I found it interesting when I was in school. So maybe if you're currently in school and listening to this, you will have too. But it might also be worth keeping it in mind, particularly that one very difficult, very significant choice to break his engagement that Kierkegaard made, as we now turn to one of his ideas. So to the idea then. In the world of philosophy and theology, Kierkegaard is most famous for one of his ideas, his notion of the so-called leap of faith. This paraphrase, which does not actually appear in Kierkegaard's writings, is gleaned from one of his most famous books, Fear and Trembling. Arguably, leap to faith would be more accurate, as has been argued in the Cambridge Companion to Kierkegaard, but that would still be a paraphrase. So it comes from Fear and Trembling, but I actually think the best place to go to for Kierkegaard's famous thoughts about the nature of faith is his relatively short text, Philosophical Fragments, which I recommend you read if you are interested in Kierkegaard. This text is not as famous as some of his other works, which will come up first if you Google his name, but it contains a distillation of some of his thoughts on faith and reason, and is not too difficult or too long. At least it's much shorter than the monstrous concluding unscientific postscript to Philosophical Fragments, which came after it, and that gives you an idea of Kierkegaard's sense of humour. Published under the pseudonym of Johannes Climacus, more on pseudonyms later, Philosophical Fragments begins with a paradox, and by a paradox I mean here a statement or problem which appears to present a logical contradiction. And the paradox that Climacus starts with in Philosophical Fragments is that from Plato's dialogue Meno, in which Socrates asks, actually I think Meno actually asked this, is it possible to search for the truth? Maybe just take a moment to think about your answer to that for yourself. You could pause the video and have a little think for a while. Here's the apparent paradox as Plato puts it. If yes, it is possible to search for the truth, then you must already know what to search for in order to search for it. However, if you already know what you're searching for, then you've got it already. You don't need to search for it. You know the truth already. So the whole idea of searching for the truth is a contradiction in terms, a paradox. It cannot be possible to search for the truth. Because equally well, you could say if no, it's not possible to search for the truth, then we're stuck. There is no truth to be found. And if there's no truth, then how do we know that it's true, that it's not possible to search for the truth? And you go round and round. That's another additional problem you could add to this paradoxical question, or this paradox raising question. So if it can't be possible to search for the truth, this leaves all these philosophers and theologians out there searching for the truth about, say, God, meaning, reality, or anything at all, really, in a bit of a pickle. This is a paradox, it's a problem. Now, Plato's unusual for us solution to this problem is to say that whenever we learn something true, we are not actually searching for and discovering anything new at all, but rather we are only remembering true ideas that we already somehow knew in our immortal soul, which pre-exists our body. And Socrates demonstrates this doctrine in the dialogue by drawing some geometry in the sand and showing a slave boy, or actually waking up some truths of geometry in a slave boy, to demonstrate that the boy must have known these things already. And all that a teacher does is act as a midwife to allow a person to recollect ideas which they already somewhere know. It's odd to us. It's likely to us a very weird idea, but that is what Plato argued for in response to this problem. In Philosophical Fragments, Kierkegaard, via Johannes Climacus, then takes this Platonic idea of recollecting the truth and asks, what if the truth that a person is to learn is so foreign to them, so impossible for them to grasp by their own powers alone, that the mechanism in passing it to them may not merely help them to recollect it, but must give it to them anew, and not only give them the truth, but also give them the very ability to comprehend it, which they lack in themselves. The truths he has in mind here are, of course, the Christian truths of God's existence and salvation, being saved by God through Jesus Christ. He doesn't actually say that outright because he's playing a game and being ironic and having a bit of a laugh in Philosophical Fragments, but it is absolutely clear that that's what he's talking about, that's what he has in mind. And he even jests with an imaginary reader saying that to him in the text. So Climacus's view is that we simply could not come to an apprehension of such truths through our own reason because their object is God, who by definition is utterly different to us. In a later text, Kierkegaard would famously write that there is an infinite qualitative difference between God and man. and whose nature, God's nature, is beyond our powers of comprehension. Actually, to be fair, he would dislike the word object, but never mind. We'll call God an object for now. Therefore, Climacus argues, if we were to come to a legitimate apprehension of these truths, God exists, and I have been saved by God through Jesus Christ, it could only be via a mechanism whereby God enters into the visible realm and himself imparts to us the ability to comprehend them, which we do not already possess in and of ourselves. That was difficult, so here's a summary to help. So in other words, the transcendent God would have to enter into our world in a form where we can have the possibility of receiving him as one of us, if we are to learn a truth that is utterly different from us and to learn a truth anew rather than merely recollecting it. So this inhabitation of the finite by the infinite, of the immanent by the transcendent, of the human by God, this God becoming a man, Kierkegaard calls the God-man. And Climacus says, sorry, I should have said Climacus a second ago, Climacus calls this the God-man, or says if this were to ever happen, it would be the God-man for it to happen. Climacus says this God-man is paradoxical in himself, because it is a contradiction, or he is a contradiction in terms that our reason cannot make sense of. An offence to our reason, in fact. So Climacus calls the God-man the absolute paradox, a contradiction in the purest sense in himself. Because how can the infinite inhabit the finite? How can the transcendent enter into the immanent? How can God become a man? It's contradictory. It's absolutely paradoxical. And here we have the reason why Kierkegaard is commonly labelled a fideist or a voluntarist, someone who thinks that faith is irrational and not something that is adopted on the basis of reason, but rather something that is simply chosen irrationally. Climacus holds that the object of Christian faith, the God-man Jesus Christ, is a paradoxical offence to reason, in whom reason cannot persuade us to believe. This connects to the famous phrase associated with Kierkegaard, the leap of faith. In having faith, a person must make a kind of leap, which reason cannot persuade them to do. Indeed, this identification situates Kierkegaard firmly on one particular side of a fierce debate within philosophy and theology, which some of you might be familiar with, that over the relationship between faith and reason. Rationalist or natural theologians, such as a Christian Wolff or a William Paley, see reason as ultimately leading to faith, with a faith founded on reason. A revelationist, on the other hand, such as a John Calvin or a Karl Barth, would see faith as something independent of reason, essentially overriding it, and its contents as having to be revealed to us, rather than reasoned towards, reasoned up to. But let us pause here. This widely held view of Kierkegaard as an irrationalist, revelationist, deserves qualification, and it can be challenged. If you have studied philosophy and or theology, or you're going on to, you will have learned, or you will learn even more, that even more than you know now, that it is not necessarily so easy to pigeonhole and categorize different thinkers. And you will have become, or you will become, even more aware of the different subtleties and nuances to their writings. Let's just break down for a moment what that word irrational means. For an idea or a behavior to be irrational, on my definition, it must not make sense to our reason, because it contains logical contradictions or is just meaningless gibberish. In this sense, the subject of Christian faith, namely the incarnation of Jesus, or the God-man, is most certainly irrational for Climacus, because it is a paradoxical contradiction, so irrational as to be absolutely paradoxical. But is faith in the God-man itself also irrational for Climacus? Well, in the sense that it is irrational to believe in the existence of something irrational, yes. However, and it is a big however in 24-point font and bold, while Climacus argues that our reason cannot persuade us to have faith in the God-man, we could equally well say that neither can our reason persuade us not to have faith in the God-man. In fact, it is not a matter of reason at all. Instead, Climacus speaks about having faith in the God-man using language of engagement, of being possessed by the absolute paradox rather than possessing him. language that is for me increasingly invocative of language to do with having a religious experience, by the way, in an encounter which has nothing to do with our reason. In other words, we might read Clearmarcus as effectively saying that when it comes to faith, reason gets you neither way. It is other parts of the human being that are involved when faith is present, such as the will or perhaps the spirit. In the light of these observations, one might argue, as I have tried to do at times in my academic career, that Clearmarcus does not see faith as being entirely irrational, that is nonsensical to reason, but as being ultimately irrational or non-rational, that is beyond reason, operating outside of the bounds of reason entirely. He might argue back that the difference is irrelevant or illusory or false, but I will reply that the idea here is that the having of faith is not simply self-contradictory to reason, but entirely beyond the comprehension of reason, and so whether one has faith or not must be decided on the basis of something other than reason. This issue is at least complex enough that I could be set in one of my undergraduate finals papers the question, is Kierkegaard a fideist, and be awarded marks for arguing no, or at least no, not straightforwardly. Of course, all of this is potentially hugely problematic. For a start, in order to set forth this viewpoint that faith is beyond reason, Kierkegaard wrote a book using language, making a kind of reasoned argument. And this view clearly won't satisfy everyone. For if it is correct, then the only way to discover how to have faith is actually to have it, mysteriously, passionately, independent of rational argument. Furthermore, if we care to engage with it, there is also the problem of whether this is what Kierkegaard himself actually thought. You may have noticed that I've taken great care thus far at times, except for when I made a little slip up earlier, there's another one, to speak about Kierkegaard at times, and at other times Johannes Clearmarcus, the pseudonym under which Philosophical Fragments was published. This is because Kierkegaard wrote many of his books under different pseudonyms, and in at least one place in his writings he expressed the wish that when quotations from his works are made, they be attributed to the relevant pseudonym where appropriate, rather than himself. Nothing is straightforward with Kierkegaard. While the rest of the world that reads Kierkegaard goes on straightforwardly attributing everything that he wrote to him, and sees that all is describing his own views, what this has done in Kierkegaard's scholarship is added an extra layer of interpretative difficulty. Is this what Kierkegaard really thought, or is it just what he had a pseudonym say in order to explore a particular point of view? In fact, this difficulty is so prominent in Kierkegaard's studies that it has made him a favourite of many 20th and 21st century deconstructive thinkers. Deconstruction, if you haven't met it before, is a tedious and irritating, in my opinion, intellectual movement most closely associated with the French philosopher Jacques Derrida that has infected most university centres of European philosophy and theology. Maybe after Brexit happens, deconstruction will leave UK universities, and that will be a surprise bonus side effect. I jest. Deconstruction emphasizes, among other things, the impossibility of our ever being able to know what someone really means or really thinks. Why? Because the only way we have to speak about what we mean is by using more language. So our thoughts are forever imprisoned within language, and we have no way of finding any kind of absolute meaning or truth beyond it. In the language of some deconstructive thinkers, there is no grand transcendental signified that we can lay hold of. We are stuck, perhaps lost at sea in the play of mere signifiers, irrevocably, unavoidably. Whether they know it or not, by the way, people who talk about the world being post-truth are mimicking Derrida. Now, these deconstructionists would see Kierkegaard with his multiple pseudonyms and labyrinthine corpus of work as being a kind of forerunner of their style of thinking, and argue that even when he attached his own name, Soren Kierkegaard, to one of his works, it was inevitably only as another kind of pseudonym. As another brief aside, this appropriation of Kierkegaard by people with whom I argue he would have heavily disagreed is utterly typical of the proliferation of Kierkegaard studies. Basically, everyone wants a piece of Kierkegaard. Atheists, philosophers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, and to a lesser extent Heidegger, took out what was Christian in him and called him a proto-existentialist. Postmodernists call him a proto-postmodernist. Deconstructionists call him a proto-deconstructionist. But if you ever read Kierkegaard for yourself, you will find that what he was most frequently and best was a Christian poet writing about the passion of having faith in Jesus Christ. But to return to the problem of Kierkegaard's pseudonymity, which we're discussing here, this extra interpretative layer further prizes open the question of whether or not Kierkegaard himself actually thought that coming to have faith was a process that was entirely irrational. It is a question that is open to the extent that both my master's and doctoral supervisors, whom I won't name drop because I don't want to come across like an arrogant Wally, for want of a better word, and because you probably won't have heard of them anyway, could tell me that they didn't think that Kierkegaard actually himself saw the process of coming to have faith as entirely independent of reason. We could, for example, mine the writings which Kierkegaard published under his own name in his vast convoluted private journals for references to faith to try to come up with a different conclusion about what the real Kierkegaard actually thought about it. As it turns out, I didn't always disagree with them, but I've lately come to the view that my supervisors were wrong on this point. To be honest, though, I don't think what the real Kierkegaard really thought actually matters, as if we could ever find that out anyway. Only Kierkegaard's scholars are really going to care. For me, what really matters are the ideas themselves. Is faith irrational or not? And the ideas that Kierkegaard set forth that have been most read and discussed are the ideas which hold that faith is irrational, or at the very least, irrational. So to close, I would like to set out to you some evaluative thoughts on whether or not faith is rational, in dialogue with this view from Kierkegaard, similar to the kind that you might find at the conclusion of an A-level essay on faith and reason, which will be useful to some of you, I hope, listening to this. Although I'll be speaking a little more personally here than that context might call for. As someone who has a Christian faith and who tends to obsessively overthink things, the question of whether or not having faith is rational is of titanic importance to me personally. And in truth, to return to a little bit of autobiography which I warned you about earlier in the talk, in my own life I have been somewhat schizophrenic about my answer to this question. At some points in my life, such as when I went to university for the first time to study theology, I completely agree with Climacus that faith is irrational and that the process of coming to have it does not involve reason at all. But these days, I'm actually not so sure. When I read and reread the foundational documents of the Christian faith, the New Testament, for example, and when I think about why I have faith, I do find some reasons, as perhaps indicated by the fact that I can think about this at all. What reasons do I find? Yes, on the one hand, I find the reason of personal experience and of encounter with Christ, which is very difficult to describe rationally. But I also find the reasonable evidence of historical testimony. Because I find that there is strong historical evidence that Jesus came back to life from the dead, I conclude that it is worth believing that he did so, and therefore that it is worth trusting what he had to say. As the author of the Gospel of John writes, "These things are written so that you may believe that Jesus was the Son of God." And I've come to understand that "so that" as a kind of appeal to our reason. Of course, Climacus would say that these words just provide an occasion for an irrational coming to faith, but I've become suspicious that they are actually making a kind of an appeal to our reason. I also relatedly find reasonable evidence in miraculous reports, both in the Bible and, incidentally, in some contemporary reports too. Some contemporary reports. This reasoning might run as follows. If there is a God, then God is able temporarily to suspend the regular behavior of nature to perform miracles. Because there are some credible reports of miracles in the Bible and even elsewhere in contemporary testimony, I conclude that it is likely there is such a God. Or if you prefer, believe me, says Jesus again in John's Gospel, when I say that I am the Son of God, paraphrasing, or at least believe because of the miracles themselves. These days, I read this as a kind of an appeal to our reason too. So, while I would concede that if there is a God, the object, or Kierkegaard would say the subject, and ultimate source of faith, must lie beyond our reason, I have come to believe that when we encounter this God, though we must make a choice to believe or not believe in him that is irrational, he also makes an appeal to us on the basis of our reason, which he himself equipped us with, of course. I have therefore come to disagree with my mentors, Kierkegaard and Climacus, that reason gets you neither way. Instead, I would hold now that reason gets you some of the way, that indeed, in order for a person to have Christian faith, they must make a kind of a leap to faith, but this is not a leap in the dark. Rather, it is a leap that is made in territory that is at least partly illuminated by the light of our God-given reason. I'm not entirely sure whether the real Kierkegaard, so-called real Kierkegaard, would have agreed with me about this, but let me end by telling you a secret. I don't really care anymore. Thank you for watching. So like, comment and subscribe, folks. Here are some suggested avenues for discussion. Looking forward to talking with you further.